video is brought to you by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. This is the Xiaomi Mi Note 10. This phone actually was released in November, and it particularly interested me in that it is a photography feature-based device that actually comes in at a much lower price point than some of the big-name flagships. Folks, this is a $435 phone that, oh yeah, happens to feature 6 camera modules, including the main camera, which features a 108 megapixel sensor, similar to what you see on the Samsung S20 Ultra, but that phone is like 3 times the cost of this one, and it has a 5,260 milliamp battery and a headphone jack, which has become increasingly more and more rare these days. What makes this phone extremely attractive to me is that Xiaomi are clearly trying to deliver something that comes in a more affordable package. Now, typically when a company does this, you've got to cut corners on things and you have an overall reduced experience generally. They did not do that on this phone. In fact, everything pretty much went into the battery and the camera features, and they do not disappoint. You've got pretty much everything from a 5x telephoto lens clear down to an ultra wide. You even have a macro lens on here. So this phone is going to give you way more range in terms of photography than pretty much anything that I've used so far. So breaking this down, we have, as I mentioned, no less than 6 camera modules. There's a 32 megapixel selfie camera on the front of the phone, which is actually among the better ones that I've seen. On the back of the phone, we have 5. That's right, there's 5 camera modules that run across the side. And you also have 2 pairs of flashes. There is a lot of stuff going on here. So you've got the main camera, which combines a 108 megapixel. This is a 1/1.33 inch sensor, which has a 7-element lens. There is also a 2x 12 megapixel portrait lens, a 5x 5 megapixel telephoto lens. There is an ultra wide angle lens that comes in at 20 megapixels. And finally, you've got a 2 megapixel macro camera. This is a serious range that's covered using physical optics. So how is the image quality on this phone? Well, in general, it is quite excellent. I do have a few things that I think are worth pointing out to be a little bit careful with. I want to show you some images. And of course, when you have a phone that produces images at this quality, you're going to want to have a website to put them on to show them off, which brings us to our sponsor today, who are the awesome folks over at Squarespace.com. Present your photography using Squarespace's modern professional portfolios. The layouts are completely customizable, and you can use Squarespace's drag and drop based backend system, which is really easy to use to present your work the way that you want it seen. Squarespace is an all-in-one platform for building beautiful websites, easily claiming your domain or URL, and creating a custom site that brings your ideas to life. Squarespace is host to a number of other tools, including e-commerce, appointment scheduling, and analytics, so that you can grow your brand and your following. So head over to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, you can go to squarespace.com/AOP to save an additional 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Once again, that is squarespace.com/AOP, and I want to thank the folks at Squarespace for sponsoring another episode of The Art of Photography. So let's talk about image quality and what you can expect from the Mi Note 10. Now, generally, when it comes to smartphones, I think there's 2 different ways you can look at it. So first of all is just looking at it with everything into computational imaging and automation and letting the phone do its thing. And so this is honestly the experience that most people have with it. So we're not worried about raw files. We're not worried about manual modes. We're just letting the phone do its thing. And then the second way you can look at it is nerds like me who are going to come at it and really tear it apart and nitpick lens quality and things like that. So in general, when you're just letting the phone do its thing, it does an incredible job. The color, contrast, detail, everything looks really good. The only exception to this is when you want to go beyond that 5x zoom and you go into a digital zoom. I don't think it looks good. That's my biggest complaint with it, but you do have 5 lenses, so you've got an incredible range just with the optics here. So I don't think it's a really big deal. The big surprise for me on this phone is the macro lens. As I mentioned, that's very unconventional. It's not something you see on phones very often. It allows you to get extreme close-ups, and it opens up a whole world of photography that you really don't get with most standard smartphones. In fact, I think this is a feature that I really wish most manufacturers would start including in their lens arsenal. Of course, it means a dedicated lens, but on this phone, it makes it something that's really unique, and for me, that is a big plus. There is a pro mode on the camera app that will allow for full manual control, including manual focus, which is actually really nice, especially when you're working with the macro lens and your depth of field becomes very shallow and you want to be selective about where your focus point is. It's something that's really nice to have. And this mode will let you shoot raw DNG files from from the ultra-wide lens, the standard wide, and the macro lenses. Unfortunately, this does not do RAW from either one of the two telephoto lenses, but this is actually more RAW compatibility than you're going to get with most cameras. One I can think of in particular would be the iPhone, which natively does not let you capture RAW images at all. They're always JPEGs that have always been processed, and to do DNG files on an iPhone, you have to use a third-party app like Lightroom Mobile. Speaking of, I use Lightroom Mobile not so much for shooting, but this is where I kind of capture all my images and then I'm able to upload them to the cloud. They automatically download into my library, and I can also apply presets from my own preset packs, which is really nice because it makes editing speed up. I can get really good results really quickly, and everything syncs back up into the library on my computer. So I would say that color, exposure, overall image quality is very consistent on this phone. A lot of times when you have smartphones, which they all do now, where you have multiple lenses and multiple sensors, sometimes there's some inconsistencies, particularly in color, when you start switching back and forth between focal lengths, and everything is really clean and seems very synced up on here. And I think that when you're considering this is a $435 phone, that is something that's pretty amazing at this price point. This is something that is hard to do on some flagship phones, and ones that do typically cost sometimes 3 times the price of this phone. But there are a few little tiny caveats that I do want to mention. So let's start with this 108 megapixel sensor. Now this is something that's actually not unique to the Mi Note 10. We also have a similar issue with the 108 megapixel sensor that's on the Samsung S20 Ultra. I covered that in my preview video with that phone as well. In all fairness, this sensor was never designed to be a high resolution sensor. What it's designed to do is actually oversample the image. So you're using 108 megapixels to sample this large area, and then through a process called pixel binning, you're actually going to reduce that down. So in the end, you get a roughly 27 megapixel image, which is still pretty big in terms of resolution, but it allows you to get a cleaner image by doing that oversampling and then downscaling. However, marketing teams love stats like that, so they want to say that this phone is going to outdo any camera on the market, and so we're going to advertise it as being a 108 megapixel sensor, and they actually put a 108 megapixel mode into this you have to go into specifically. Now, when you shoot on this, it's the same problem that you have on the Samsung S20 Ultra, in that all of a sudden you're going to start exposing all of the blemishes that you're going to see on a lens, which basically means this is sharp in the middle, and as you go out towards the sides, you're going to start seeing all kinds of strange blurry distortion, and it really is tough to do a lens that is this size. This is a huge challenge because, one, it is a high resolution sensor, and two, it is actually a physically bigger sensor slightly than the sensors that you're used to getting your standard 12 megapixel images out of a smartphone. And so with a bigger sensor means that you have a shallower depth of field, and so sharpness issues, this starts to expose all of the problems you're going to have with teeny tiny lens setups. And so this is going to be a challenge moving forward as more and more phones start to adapt larger sensors. There are benefits to having a larger sensor in the phone, but it does create problems as well. Let me give you a little example so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is a test that I typically do on much larger lenses that go on proper cameras when we're really picking apart the image quality and seeing what the lens can produce. Now, I'm going to do this test on the standard 108 megapixel camera in this phone and the lens that goes with it so you can see what I'm talking about. So what you need to do is you have the lens at its widest setting, which a camera phone, the lenses are always on their widest settings. And what you do is you pick a point of focus that is on some texture. And I usually use the street out in front of the studio. And so what I do is I put that focus point a few feet away from me. And what you do is you bring this into Photoshop and you use something called the Find Edges filter. This filter has no parameters on it. All it does is it just uses a black and white spectrum, and anything that is sharp in the image is going to retain texture. It's going to go black. Anything that starts to lose sharpness is going to go white. So typically with a really nice lens, you're going to get a very thin line that typically is as straight as possible. And this is the area that's in focus. If we use an image that was taken on something like the iPhone 11, this is a 12 megapixel sensor. It's got a really good lens on it, but you can see that we have a much broader depth of field. A lot more of this image is just natively in focus. Now remember, this is a larger sensor in the Mi Note 10, which means you're going to get a shallower depth of field, which is not a problem necessarily, but when I run this through the filter, you can see that really only the center of this lens is really in focus. Everything else kind of falls off to the sides. Now, does that mean it's a bad lens? Well, it does mean there's some shortcomings, but the fact that you know this and you're going to use this device basically means that you understand what types of shots are really going to look good. So anything that's going to cover a lot of fine details at the edges, like a landscape or even some kind of close-up shot that has a lot of detail in it, is going to be something you're going to start seeing problems with. However, if you like to shoot portraits or you shoot objects objects that typically have blurred areas that are out of focus around them, it will perform just fine. So I thought it was worth pointing out, and it's actually interesting when you actually visualize what that depth of field looks like. You can see what's coming off the camera. Don't tell the marketing crew, they won't like that at all. Another gripe, speaking of marketing, that I don't particularly care for on this phone is the longest telephoto lens, which is this 5x lens. It says it's a 5x lens. It's even printed right here on the front, 5x optical. It's not. It's actually a lens with a 3.7x magnification factor, but it is sitting on an 8 megapixel sensor. Now, what the Mi Note 10 does is it actually does a digital crop. So it crops it down to a 5 megapixel sensor, which is effectively going to give you a 5-time magnification factor, but just know that it's really not optically correct to say that. It's just cheating a little bit to give that up. So you're losing resolution, but you're gaining a zoom. And of course, you can pinch in to get a 30x magnification or a 50x magnification. I would skip this altogether. It just does not look good. I think some camera companies have the artificial intelligence to pass this off a little better than others. It just depends. I think that Google do this particularly well with the Pixel phones. I think that Apple does it fairly well. Huawei did it fairly well. Samsung, and you're getting into weird territory. It takes a lot of processing power to actually zoom in that far, because what you're doing is you're taking an image that's zoomed in into a small section, so it's cropped, and then you're actually trying to magnify that by increasing the resolution on the back end. It's really difficult to do. But having said that, this is just not a long lens phone. It is a very versatile phone because it has many lenses, but I would keep it within the optical range if you want to get the best results. So a final verdict, I actually really like the Mi Note 10. Now, I was just getting nitpicky about it, and the reason why is when you start using specs in marketing terms like 108 megapixels or really long telephoto lenses, you're creating an expectation in the consumer's mind, or at least a reason that you would want to go with this as a phone from a photography standpoint. And I'm going to be really honest with you, it's not. But the cameras that are in here, the fact that you have things like the macro lens, if you use the 108 megapixel more as a standard lens as it was intended, where you're going to have some downsampling, you're still going to get a 27 megapixel image. It looks absolutely great, and I think they've done an outstanding job packing a lot of photography features into a phone that comes in at a very reasonable price. Now, this will have competition, especially when you look at the lower end offerings from people like Google or Apple. For instance, the iPhone SE just came out. That has one camera on the back. This one has 5. And so there are reasons why you might want to consider the SE over something like this, but I'm just talking from purely a photography standpoint. This isn't my favorite OS in the world. It's a skin that's been built onto Android. It's kind of Huawei-ish. There's no app drawer. Of course, you can just get an app skin and go with that. But the battery life is incredible on this. They put a monster-sized battery in here. I think the camera system is really well thought out. And hey, people love that headphone jack, and that's here too. So anyway, I want to know what you guys think, so drop me a link in the comments. I'll talk to you guys later. Till the next video. See ya.